Before we talk about today's specimen, we need to discuss another Final Fantasy character, Kain Highwind from Final Fantasy IV. Kain is one of the most popular characters in the entire series, and for the life of me, I have no friggin' idea why. People talk about Kain as though he's some dark, brooding, morally ambiguous anti-hero, but no, that's not the case at all. He's an unambiguously heroic character who gets repeatedly mind-controlled by the villains, and is not interesting in the slightest. As a matter of fact, he's as shallow as they come. The idea behind him was cool, a friend and comrade of the main character who turns to evil and fights against him. But not only are his motivations incredibly weak, but he has no personality to back it up. You know what character is Kain done right? Seifer Almasy from Final Fantasy VIII. Seifer is the classmate/rival of Final Fantasy VIII's main protagonist, Squall. They're both students at Balam Garden, a military academy training mercenaries known as Seeds. Now, Seifer has delusions of grandeur and a dream of becoming something akin to a heroic knight-errant, and sees becoming a Seed as his step to doing so. However, on the final exam mission, Seifer defies orders and is unable to graduate, whereas Squall and his comrades do. In his moment of weakness, Seifer is approached by Edea, more on her later, and she appeals to his childlike fantasy to get him to become her knight, to help her take over the world. And Seifer, ever eager to one-up Squall, agrees. What I like about Seifer is that even though it's somewhat implied that there's some form of manipulation or mind control going on, his betrayal is perfectly consistent with his own personal motivations. He's already shown to have bad blood with Squall early on in the game, but as the game goes on, his mental state just keeps deteriorating, which is cleverly reflected in the clothing damage that his jacket undergoes over the course of the game. Seifer also gets some pretty interesting and intense boss fights throughout the game, although his first and fourth fights stand out in particular. The first battle against him comes at a point where the early game's plot is starting to escalate to a fever pitch, so it really feels like something big is going down, even if the fight itself is pretty easy. But then there's the fourth battle, the final fight against him late in the game, which is memorable for one main reason. If the player managed to obtain the Odin summon and try to use it against him, this happens. That, I think, speaks for itself. Now, rival characters in fiction usually tend to be seen as losers because they keep losing over and over again, but I somehow felt weirdly invested in his character. I think the exact moment I started to see him as something more than just Draco Malfoy with a sword was the interrogation in Desert Prison. This one scene puts on full display both his delusions and his cruelty, and succeeds at making him more of a legitimate threat than just some school bully. I guess my one big complaint about him is the fact that at the very end of the game, he's just anticlimactically a good guy again with absolutely no build-up or explanation why he's no longer evil. But in spite of that, Seifer is a bizarrely compelling rival character who's just really fun to hate and even more fun to fight. And speaking of characters who are fun to fight, well, join me over at number 14. After failing his master one too many times, Gilgamesh was cast into the interdimensional void and vanished. He woke to find himself trapped in another world, facing mirror images that were not his own, and driven by an unknown force to collect cheap replicas of legendary swords. His only companion on his journey is Enkidu, a dog-like creature, or occasionally just a rooster he painted green. And so Gilgamesh travels from life to life, striving to beat up what needs beating up, and hoping each time that the next leap will be the leap home. What am I being so somber for? Gilgamesh doesn't get pathos. Yeah, Final Fantasy has a long history of legacy characters. Throughout every game you'll see a bunch of reoccurring character names like Cid or Mog or Biggs and Wedge, but that's not really the case with Gilgamesh. Whenever you run into Gilgamesh in a Final Fantasy game, it's always the same guy. In Final Fantasy V, he made his debut as a henchman of Exdeath, who I already talked about. He was a recurring boss throughout the game, and quickly became one of the most popular characters with a combination of his awesome boss fight, awesome theme music, bumbling antics, and lovable ego. Towards the end of the game, he failed X-Death one too many times and got thrown into the void, and then he ended up in Final Fantasy VIII. From then on, Gilgamesh has been wandering the multiverse looking for legendary swords, or at least what passes for them, as well as just looking for a good fight. He basically became Final Fantasy's equivalent of Deadpool, always making cameos left and right, seeming to have an awareness of the fourth wall, and just always being a treat whenever he shows up. He's taken on many forms over the years, from a Colosseum fighter, to a con artist / card game champion, to a mythical guardian of all things, and sometimes he's played more seriously than other times. For example, in Final Fantasy VIII, he's played relatively straight, being a stoic, if kinda completely and utterly lost, swordsman just looking for a good fight. Compare this with his appearance in Final Fantasy XIV, where he's a bumbling idiot who accidentally joins the manhunt for himself. But no matter what form he takes, or how seriously or how funny he's played, Gilgamesh is a series staple, and I look forward to seeing him in more games to come.
Filth and squalor everywhere I look. How very dull. What I wouldn't do for a drink.
Of all of Final Fantasy XIV's expansions so far, Stormblood is probably the weakest. However, it does something pretty unique that I don't see a whole lot of other works doing. Now, stories about rebellions fighting against evil empires is nothing new. However, Stormblood provides something of a unique perspective on this by showing exactly what it's like for the occupied nations. Throughout the story, we see nations that are under Garlean occupation, whose primary tormentors aren't necessarily their overlords, but rather their own countrymen who have turned against them. Enter Yotsuyu. Yotsuyu was a Doman child whose step-parents wanted absolutely nothing to do with her, instead focusing their attention on her brother, Asahi. Eventually, they got sick of her and decided to make a quick buck by selling her to a brothel, where she proceeded to get a front row seat to the worst of humanity. This, in turn, developed a deep hatred in her for her fellow Domans. However, her position just so happened to make her valuable as an informant for the Garlean Empire during their invasion. When Doma was finally brought to heel, they rewarded her by making her regent of the area, and she relished the chance to making the Domans suffer in every way she could think of. Throughout the whole Doma story arc, she displays pointless, petty cruelty at every turn. Her introduction shows her forcing a helpless villager to shoot his own parents simply because they're too old to work. In a worse game, this could have resulted in her being completely one-dimensional and flat, but Yotsuyu goes so far over the edge in her sadism that it makes her insanely memorable. Every word she says is just dripping in spite, coupled with some really excellent voice work. Her design also reinforces her personality as someone who sees herself better than everyone around her, and she firmly believes that she deserves to be able to inflict all this pain and death on her former countrymen. And after we learn just where she came from, it's not exactly hard to see her point. Ultimately, her sadism winds up being not only her own, but her superior Zenith's downfall by getting the Warrior of Light involved. Later on, she's presumed dead in the destruction of Doma Castle, but then she turns up alive and well later on. And this is where she gets interesting. See, Yotsuyu was presumed dead along with another character, a heroic samurai named Gosetsu. The two of them show up alive and well later on, but it turns out Yotsuyu has amnesia. Her mind reverted to that of a child, both in the way she talks and the way she thinks. Now I know what you're thinking. Amnesia? Really? And yeah, that's honestly what I thought too at first, but the way it's written makes it absolutely heartbreaking. See, her relationship with Gosetsu continues to evolve over the course of the rest of the expansion, and she basically gets to have the childhood she never could have. However, it was not to be. Remember when I mentioned her brother Asahi? Yeah, he's an Imperial loyalist, and he shows up later on with the sole intent of bringing back her memories. He does this by dragging her adoptive parents back into the mix. It's really sad, actually. When she does get her memory back, she's absolutely horrified by what she did. But then her parents decide to be their old abusive selves again, and she remembers just why she had that hatred in the first place. And while it is a shame that she turned back to evil, her parents were openly talking about selling her back into sex slavery the first chance they got. So when she murders them, I'm honestly kind of on her side. She then goes along with Asahi's plan to torpedo the negotiations between Garlemald and Doma following the war. And we see here that no matter how much she regrets her former actions, she's more or less resigned to it by this point and doesn't see any way out. This is also the part of the game where she transforms into the primal Tsukiyomi, and in the ensuing fight, not only is the music absolutely beautiful and the fight really challenging, but it also provides a fascinating insight into her character. During the fight, she summons illusions of all the people who have wronged her over the years to fuel her own anger. But despite this, one of the illusions is of Gosetsu, who tries to appeal to her better nature and get her to turn back. But as far as she's concerned, it's too late for her. In the end, Yotsuyu is an incredibly well-written character, both as a villain and as a victim of abuse. She's one of the main reasons why I'm hesitant to write off Stormblood like so many others do, and she is easily one of my favorite characters in Final Fantasy XIV. My experience with Final Fantasy VIII was a weird one. I started off absolutely hating the game, but as I went through it, it was just a roller coaster of highs and lows that in the end averaged out to pretty good. And one of the aspects that I initially hated but slowly started to grow an appreciation for was the villain, Ultimecia. Ultimecia is a sorceress from the future. She took over the world and rules with an iron fist, but she knows that one day she's destined to be slain by a mercenary from the VIII program. As a result, she appropriates a machine that allows her to transfer her consciousness into the past and possess a sorceress from that era, a sorceress named Edea. She took control of the military superpower Galbadia in an attempt to use its resources to wipe VIII off the face of the earth, all the while continuing her grand plan to send her consciousness further into the past, so with the power of 3 sorceresses in the past, present, and future, she can compress time into a single moment for some reason. Yeah, if you're looking for a villain with a clear and interesting motivation, you're not going to find one here. Well, I mean, that's only partially true. Early on in the game, she makes it pretty clear that a big part of her goal is to avenge the persecution sorceresses have faced. But what does that have to do with time travel shenanigans and time compression? And yeah, that was admittedly one of the big reasons why I kind of disliked her as a villain at first, but over time, she really kind of grew on me for one reason. She is without a doubt one of the most terrifying villains in the entire franchise. Every scene she's in is drenched with this dark, horrifying atmosphere. Anytime she enters the scene, the temperature drops like 5 degrees. There's a scene late in the game where she possesses Rinoa in one of the most unsettling scenes in the entire series, and when she's inhabiting the body of Edea, she gets up to some pretty nasty stuff. The scene where she first takes over Galbadia is a pretty good example of how scary she is. After she effortlessly immobilizes Rinoa in the middle of her poorly thought out attempt to depower her, she proceeds to the podium where the president is, murders him right in front of the cheering crowd, then she uses her powers to keep them in a cheering trance while she delivers an absolutely scathing acceptance speech, in which she condemns them for cheering her on while they persecuted sorceresses in the past. In spite of all this going for her, it's kinda hard to take her seriously once we see her true form. I mean, just look at her. She just looks so incredibly silly with those pointless wings, that exaggerated plunging neckline, those hair horns. Her design makes Queen Amidala look subtle by comparison, which is a real shame because she spends most of the game possessing Edea, and Edea's design is absolutely perfect. However, her design issues are swiftly forgotten when she actually takes on the heroes personally, and in my opinion, she gives us the best final boss in the entire series. She goes through multiple different forms and creates a demonic beast from the repressed insecurity and self-loathing of the main character, merging with it and then becoming an absolutely horrifying final form. The battle gets especially interesting when you consider that not only do your overpowered summons not work on her, but she has the power to destroy spells right out of your inventory. This sets the player on edge the entire fight without making it unfair, which is something I can appreciate in the final fight. So while she is a bit lacking in the backstory and motivation department, leaving most of it up to interpretation, she still manages to be a credible threat that lives up to the build-up and provides some legitimately disturbing moments throughout the game. And you can argue that her backstory being a complete mystery only adds to her terror, so in any case, she earns her spot on the list.
We must see the real thing to be sure. Nabadis taught us much. Yes, it's well hidden. They'll be off chasing after shadows, the fools. Ah, yes. The reins of history back in the hands of man.
Remember when I talked about legacy characters in my Gilgamesh video? The most enduring of these legacy characters is none other than Cid. Every game since Final Fantasy II has had a version of the character, and they're always some sort of scientist, pilot, or engineer or whatnot. However, somewhere around 2010, the series had this really weird kick of having evil Cids. And out of all of these, the most memorable is the one from Final Fantasy XII, Dr. Cid, whose full name I'm not even going to try to say, not only because it's hard to remember, but because it's incredibly silly. Dr. Cid is the brilliant scientific mind behind the Arcadian Empire's research into Nethicite, a powerful element that absorbs mist and releases it as magic, spelled with a K for some reason. Cid immediately saw the applications of his discovery and used it to create all sorts of machines, airships, weapons, you name it. However, he owed a lot of his knowledge to a being called Vayne, who is an Occuria. Now, the Occuria are basically godlike beings who have manipulated the course of history through puppet kings for centuries because they believe humanity is too stupid to be trusted with their own free will. Cid and Vayne share a common goal of putting the reins of history back in the hands of men. However, despite his brilliance, he's written off by many as just a mad scientist, because not only did his research lead him to forsake any and all sense of ethics, but also due to the fact that Vayne only appears to a select few, making it seem to most people as though he's having animated discussions with empty space. Now, Final Fantasy XII's writing has always been a treat. It manages to sound elevated and almost Shakespearean without coming off as pretentious, coupled with some excellent voice acting. I bring this up because it emphasizes just how hammy Dr. Cid is. Every other line he says is dripping with over-the-top enthusiasm. As you'll see as we get closer to number 1, I've always had a soft spot for villains with a flair for the theatric, and Dr. Cid is theatric, bombastic, and fond of grand sweeping gestures, and overall he's just so much fun to watch.
A trial for a Shelia Banargan Dalmasca!
Over the course of the game, you fight against him twice, and both of those fights are really intense and really fun. He employs all manner of scientific devices to assist him, leading up to his secret weapon. A freaking Gatling gun!
No pity from me! Stand and fight!
It also helps that the second fight against him occurs at what is ostensibly the real climax of the story, and as a result has a ton of emotional weight to it. One thing I really do love about not just Dr. Cid, but all of the villains in 12, is the legitimate sense of camaraderie between all the villains. Dr. Cid's relationship with the other bad guys is part mutual respect, part manipulation. It's implied near the end of the game that he was considering betraying his superiors for the sake of scientific curiosity. If I do have one complaint about him, it's that his relationship with Balthier isn't explored as much as it could have been. I mean, Balthier is Dr. Cid's estranged son, and yet the game hardly ever seems to delve into that. I want to say Dr. Cid is one of the best examples of a mad scientist in fiction, but he is not mad. He's just really theatric and bombastic in everything he does. He may not have the bottomless well of evil as Dr. Hojo, but he makes up for it with memorable presence, excellent boss fights, and endearingly over-the-top mannerisms. And to think, he's not even the highest-ranking 12 villain on this list. Well, everyone, looks like we're in the home stretch. We're in the top 10, and we're going to start seeing the really good villains. And first up, we got another Final Fantasy Tactics villain, Wiegraf Folles. Wiegraf was once a member of the Dead Men, a military unit made up of peasants that fought alongside the nobility during Ivalice's 50 Years' War. After the war ended, however, Ivalice's economy was in a state of complete disrepair, so as a result, he and the rest of his unit were denied payment. In outrage towards the nobilities throwing the commoners under the bus yet again, he and many of the other soldiers who fought under him, including his sister, formed the Corpse Brigade terrorist group to strike back at the nobility. The thing that separates Wiegraf from the other villains in Tactics is his code of honor. Most of the other villains in Tactics, including one that we're going to get to later on this list, are just completely and utterly ruthless and nothing is beneath them. But Wiegraf, however, he refuses to see his followers becoming common bandits, and when one of his underlings kidnaps the Marquis Elmdor against his wishes, Wiegraf's response, after punishing said soldier for his insubordination, is to release him back without ransom. His goal isn't to get revenge, it's to reform the way the country is run so he and his fellow commoners won't keep getting screwed over. Really, despite his extreme measures, his intentions are noble, pardon the pun, and he could have been a heroic rebel if things had played out differently. But alas, it was not to be. When an assassination attempt on the nobility goes awry, the Corpse Brigade flees with Tietra, the sister of one of the main characters, as a hostage. Remember when I mentioned Wiegraf's sister who fought alongside him? Well, this is where she becomes important, because on his way to rescue Tietra, the main character, Ramza, ends up fighting and killing her. Once Wiegraf finds out about this, he swears revenge, even after the Corpse Brigade disintegrates. And as luck would have it, in his moment of weakness, he's approached by the Knights Templar with an offer to join them. Remember when I talked about Daisadarg and how weak it was that he was possessed by one of the Lusavi? Well, the same thing happens to Wiegraf, except here, it honestly feels like a natural extension of his character. The entire point of his character is that he throws away his morals in an attempt to get petty revenge. So him being taken over by a Lusavi actually works to the character's benefit instead of just cheapening the conflict. However, this ties into the biggest weakness of his character: the fight against him. Dear, sweet, merciful Arceus, his boss fight. Okay, when you finally confront him for the last time late in the game, the fight comes in two phases. A one-on-one fight between him and the protagonist, Ramza, and then an all-out fight between the entire group, and Wiegraf's new demonic form and his demonic allies. Both of these fights are so unfair and so poorly designed that it very nearly made me rage quit the game and is the main reason why I have yet to play Tactics a second time, in spite of just how much of a rare gem it is. But really, the fact that he still made it into the top 10 in spite of how bad his boss fight is really speaks volumes to how effective he is as a character. The real ironic thing is, by the end of the game, the main character winds up becoming what Wiegraf almost was. So in spite of how comparatively minor of a player he is in the story of Tactics, Wiegraf is one of the most memorable adversaries you come across, for better or for worse. And a pretty unique villain as far as the entire series is concerned. And to think, we still have one more Tactics villain left on the list.
This eternity, it was never your desire. Is that not so? You...
Just to be perfectly honest, I have never played Final Fantasy XIII-2, nor do I have any intention of doing so. However, the second I found out about its main villain, I immediately knew that he was going to be one of Final Fantasy's greats. This is Caius Ballad. Caius was the bodyguard to a prophetess named Yule. Yule has the power to see the future, but she has this problem of dying every time she does so. Whenever that happens, Caius gets sent off to the next timeline over to guard that timeline's version of Yule, who would then see the future and then die, and then he would get sent to the next timeline, and so on. Eventually, this drove him kind of nuts. And he came to the conclusion that, hey, she won't keep dying if she can't see the future, and she can't see the future if there is no future, and so he set off into the space-time continuum with the sole goal of wrecking it beyond repair. One thing I find interesting about Caius is the way he ties into the overarching themes of Final Fantasy XIII and its sequels. All three games have this undercurrent of the main characters defying their fate and going against what destiny has in store for them and that sort of thing. Caius reflects sort of the dark side of that, where he wants to go against destiny, but at the cost of everyone else. Aside from his thematic significance, Caius is solid in pretty much every way. He works well as a cold, dangerous villain, but he has some genuine humanity with his relationship with Yule. He's got some cool theme music, he's got some excellent voice acting courtesy of Liam O'Brien.
He is living in a time and place where he knows only joy. He acknowledged his defeat, and now he is at peace.
And he's got some epic boss fights to boot. But there's one thing that truly sets him apart from other villains in this franchise. The fact that he wins. And no, I'm not talking about it in the sense that he achieves his goal but then gets defeated. No. I'm talking about Thanos at the end of Infinity War levels of winning.
You should have gone for the head.
Like, at the end of Final Fantasy XIII-2, the deity Etro is dead, and he's kicking back on her throne, gloating about how he's played the heroes at every turn with a very much alive Yule beside him. And yeah, there is another game after this, so obviously his victory doesn't stick, but this is the way the game ends, and I find that really impressive. Now, like I said before, Caius was already a solid villain in his own right with his complex and yet strangely relatable backstory and sheer coolness factor, but the fact that he actually wins, something that I don't think any other Final Fantasy villain has done to such an extent, is what truly elevates him to the upper echelon of Final Fantasy bad guys.
You've really grown.
Yeah, but you're still bigger.
Here we have another one of those characters that I'm hesitant to even really call a villain, but unlike Golbez, he has enough agency in his situation for me to more seriously consider him for a high spot. Jecht is the father of Tidus, the main character of Final Fantasy X. He's the star player of the Blitzball team, the Xanark and Dabes. He's a raging alcoholic, a pretty big narcissist, and overall just kind of not that great of a parent. That's not to say he doesn't try, but he just never really got the memo that once you become a parent, it stops being all about you. One day, he gets carried off to the parallel world of Spira. Jecht winds up tagging along with a summoner named Braska on his pilgrimage, in order to try to find a way home. Over the course of his travels, Jecht learned humility and the value of caring about others before yourself, and eventually, when they get to the end, he realizes that he won't be able to really get home. Remember when I brought up Sin earlier when I talked about Seymour a few videos back? Well, Braska embarked on this pilgrimage in the first place to obtain the summoned beast known as the Final Aeon in order to combat Sin. In order to summon the Final Aeon, the summoner needs to transform one of his guardians into it, and Jecht volunteers because he's accepted that he's never going to find a way home, and he figures he might as well do something meaningful with his life. Despite him successfully becoming the Final Aeon and defeating Sin, Sin's creator, Yu Yevon, takes over Jecht's new body, and attempts to reform it into the new Sin. Jecht wants now to put a stop to this cycle, so now transformed into the new Sin, he returns to his home of Zanarkand and transports his son to Spira, hoping that he'll be able to find a way to permanently end the threat of Sin. Something I noticed about Final Fantasy games in general is that characters who appear primarily in flashback have a tendency to be the most interesting ones. Laguna from Final Fantasy VIII is a pretty good example, and Jecht is another one. His transformation from a self-centered abusive parent into a truly selfless hero is utterly tragic when he's transformed into an actual monster, and once you discover his true nature, it's surprisingly easy to feel the pain he's going through. As far as most of the narrative is concerned, his primary function is to be the source of Tidus's insecurities. Everything about Tidus's personality traces back to the way Jecht raised him, and in a way, he could be seen as sort of a mirror image of his father, as if he grew up specifically to avoid becoming like him. Throughout the entire course of the story, Tidus has to struggle with being connected to Jecht by the few who know that connection, and unlike his love interest Yuna, who's proud of being the daughter of Braska, Tidus is desperately trying to live down his relationship. It's kind of weird. Jecht is most effective when he's being a foil to other characters rather than being a great character in his own right, which he is. Like I mentioned before, he's technically being controlled by Yu Yevon, so I was hesitant to put him on the list, which, is the reason Golbez was so low. But we do clearly see at several points, both in his fixation with Tidus and the mechanics of the final boss, he has at least some free will left. Like I said before, his primary goal is to maneuver Tidus and his group into finally killing him and thus ending Yu Yevon's cycle of pain. It's left pretty ambiguous how much of his destructive actions are the result of Yu Yevon and how much was intentional to achieve his goal. Is it a stretch? Maybe, but that interpretation is there if you really look for it. In the end, the thing that makes Jecht so compelling despite his monstrous appearance as Sin is just how human he is. In the past, he was a flawed human being with a lot of personal growth, and in the present, his relationships with Tidus and Braska form the emotional core of the game. Not bad for a self-centered sports star. This video contains spoilers for Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers. If you have not played Shadowbringers and wish to remain unspoiled, now's your chance to escape. You have been warned.
Look at me! I have lived 1,000 of your lives. I have broken bread with you, fought with you, grown ill, grown old, sired children, and yes, welcomed death's sweet embrace. For eons have I measured your worth and found you wanting.
Oh yeah, now we're getting into the really good villains. Remember how I said in the introduction that I originally did this countdown on my nerd blog? Well, this guy didn't even exist back when I started. He was introduced in a content patch when I was halfway through. And let me tell you, the second I saw him, I knew that he was going to be one of the greats. And not only is Emet-Selch the best villain in Final Fantasy XIV, but he's one of the best villains in the entire series. Okay, there's a lot of backstory to get out of the way, but I'll try to condense it down, so pay attention. Long ago, the people of Amarot, known as the Ascians, were immortal, perfected beings who possessed creation magic that let them conjure anything their heart desired. One day, they faced a crisis when that very magic started destroying their civilization, so in order to stave off the end of the world, they sacrificed a huge number of their own to bring forth a godlike being known as Zodiark to protect them. However, some members of this group didn't like having to keep sacrificing to sustain Zodiark, so they summoned another being to counter it, this one called Heiral. The ensuing battle tore apart the very fabric of reality, splitting their perfected world into the Source and 13 shards, each with a fraction of the power and the vitality the original world held. Emet-Selch is one of the only 3 who remember the world as it originally was, so along with other worshippers of Zodiark, they set out to rejoin the shards to the Source by any means necessary to bring Zodiark back and destroy Heiral. Now, the exact mechanics of the process are kinda complicated, and I'm not gonna bore you with the details, but it basically boils down to causing chaos and destruction, and Emet-Selch accomplished this by taking on the human guise of Solus Vos Galvis, forming the Garlian Empire. The Garlian Empire is, well, basically, imagine if the Roman Empire existed in Middle-earth, had access to technology from the future, and had an aggressive campaign of militant atheism. That's Garlemald. While Solus is alluded to throughout the entirety of 14's story, it isn't until the 3rd expansion Shadowbringers that Emet-Selch comes into the fore in all of his glory. I think his entire character can be summed up by this one line.
I do not consider you to be truly alive, ergo I will not be guilty of murder if I kill you.
Really, that sums it up better than I ever could. He remembers and still yearns for the glory days of Amarot and sees mortal, fallen man as a cheap imitation, even getting angry when someone dares to suggest that they may have just as much a right to exist as his people. So he doesn't bat an eye at the thousands upon millions who die whenever a shard is rejoined to the source. They're all insects as far as he's concerned, but the thing is, even if the consequences of his actions are utterly horrifying, it's not exactly hard to see his point of view, even despite how horrific it is. Kinda reminds me of Thanos, actually. What makes his situation even more unique is that as a result of his superiority mindset, he doesn't really feel any hatred towards anyone either. Heck, for most of Shadowbringers, he calls a truce with the heroes because he's legitimately curious to see if they have the potential to attain a similar level to him. He honestly considers giving up his grand plans if the Warrior of Light shows the potential of reaching the same heights as his people, which it eventually turns out they can't, so back to plan A. This truce also gives us a chance to get to know him as a person, and his smarmy, condescending, holier-than-thou attitude is really entertaining. It's just funny to me that this scheming mass murderer is trying to act all buddy-buddy with the people who devoted their lives to stopping him, and the casual interactions between them are golden.
If you've brought your ivory standard, I'll be happy to tell you where to stick it.
Can we not simply take a moment to enjoy the view together?
One interesting thing about his character is that before you learn his true nature, it's pretty well established that when he was the Emperor, he was a bit of a theater buff and encouraged the development of the arts. You can clearly tell by his mannerisms and demeanor just how deep his love of theater goes. It's little touches like that that really make a character like this. He also gets points for completely turning the game's lore on its head with the reveal of the backstory of the Ascians. I can appreciate a villain who completely upends the status quo, and while I don't think his final battle is the best 14 has to offer, it's still really epic. I only really have a couple minor complaints about him, but one of them is sadly a problem a lot of 14 villains have. You see, Final Fantasy XIV has this nasty habit of killing off all of its best villains early. I mean, Emmet here was not only one of the 3 who remembered the original world, but he's also the progenitor of the Garland Empire, the game's most enduring antagonists. That is a lot of importance to the story, and yet he gets killed off pretty much in the same expansion he's introduced in. My other lesser issue is the fact that his very presence makes the other villains in 14 slightly worse. I mean, look at La Habrea from the vanilla game. From what you find out in the new expansion, these two share the exact same motivation, but where Emet-Selch is really cool and interesting, La Habrea is so bland and boring that he feels like a rejected Kingdom Hearts villain. But when my biggest complaints about a villain are that there isn't enough of him and he outshines all the other villains, that's a really good sign. From his introduction as the original Emperor to the excellent final battle against his Hades form, Emet-Selch is, without a doubt, the best villain in Final Fantasy XIV's run so far. It's going to be a real challenge for future villains to try to top him. So, for better or for worse, Final Fantasy VII is basically the face of the entire franchise, and that means that its villain is the face of all of the villains in the series. I've alluded to him for quite a while, so it's finally time to talk about Sephiroth. So, like I mentioned back in Hojo's video, Sephiroth had alien cells injected to him while he was still in his mother's womb. He then ended up becoming part of the Super Soldier program known as Soldier. Real creative naming there, and he became the top of his class and was basically hailed as a hero. But one day he found out about the experiments that created him, and this drove him into a rabbit hole where he came out with an incorrect belief that he was the biological son of the alien, Genova, whose cells were injected into him, and that it was his duty to finish what she started, i.e. destroying the planet. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but Final Fantasy VII wasn't really the best at explaining its own plot. The thing that makes Sephiroth such an especially strong villain is the amount of build-up he gets. Right from the beginning of the game, we keep hearing people whisper hints about Sephiroth, how great he is, how strong he was, how much Cloud hates him, etc. So it really helps to project this image of what Sephiroth might be like in the player's mind before he even shows up. This is especially great when you realize that Sephiroth is literally in the main character's head from the very beginning, so all of these hints help to reinforce that fact. Early on, we're shown in flashback just how strong Sephiroth was in his prime, and in the current day, we see more evidence of how powerful he is, and it's honestly really scary and does a great job building up to the confrontation. The funny thing about this guy is that he almost never shows up in person, but his influence is felt throughout the entire game. That's just how omnipresent of a threat he is. However, this does mean that Sephiroth is one of those villains who's kind of short on personality, but at the same time, he doesn't really need one. He's more of a force of nature than anything else. But that's not to say that Sephiroth is completely devoid of personality. For example, after Cloud is mourning the death of Aerith, which we'll get to in a bit, Sephiroth's only response is, "Don't worry, soon she will be a part of me!" Not to mention, when we see him in the Temple of the Ancients, he's just laughing his head off. So even though he's a cold and ruthless villain, he's also completely deluded. One interesting thing about him that I only noticed recently was, well, remember how I said Sephiroth is in the main character's mind since the very beginning of the game? Throughout the game, you see Sephiroth doing all sorts of spooky stuff that doesn't have anything to do with his goal of becoming a god and destroying the planet, but it becomes clear towards the end of the game that he is literally only doing this to make the main character obsessed with him so he can further his goals. That is really clever and interesting. And yeah, there is the whole thing about him murdering Aerith. Like I mentioned before with X-Death, it's rare for a villain in this series to kill off one of the main characters permanently, and Sephiroth is one of the few who actually succeeded. Now let's move on to his extremely memorable design. I mean, just look at him. The long silver hair, that black trench coat, that sword that's about as long as he is tall. His design is pretty simple compared to some of the other villains we've seen, but it's still one of the most menacing and the most memorable. And then there's the music. Do I even need to explain anything here? His music is just absolutely great. Between his normal theme music, those chosen by the planet, to his final battle theme, One-Winged Angel, all of the musical tracks associated with Sephiroth are just masterpieces. Tying into that last one though, at the end of the game we have an iconic battle with Sephiroth's Seraph form, or Seifer Sephiroth as the butchered translation called it, which is one of the most easily recognizable final bosses in the series. However, the final battles against Sephiroth are really kind of easy and unimpressive. His first form, Bizarro Sephiroth, is an absolute cakewalk to beat, and his second form, Seifer Sephiroth, isn't really that much better. His attacks follow an easily predictable pattern, and it's really easy to neuter most of his attacks with the right resistances. It's not as challenging as it could have been. Oh, and then there's that final battle where you kill him in one hit, but that's more of a cutscene, so I don't really count that, and it's still really cool to look at. But despite the anticlimax that is his final battle, Sephiroth really does deserve his place as one of Final Fantasy's greatest villains. Between his cool design to his cool music to his cool murder, I guess, Sephiroth isn't going away anytime soon, and I look forward to seeing more of him in the remake.
It's from you!
You've quite a mouth on you, princess. Forgive me. 'Tis your birth and faith that wrong you, not I.
You know how sometimes you talk about a character and say that they're an antagonist but not necessarily a villain? We had an example of that earlier with Jecht. However, Delita from Final Fantasy Tactics is weirdly kind of the opposite. He never fights against the protagonist and their goals almost never conflict, so I can't exactly call him an antagonist, but a villain? Most definitely. Delita Heiral is a commoner, but despite that, he's really close with the Baelv house, in particular their youngest son, Ramza. However, when his sister Tietra is taken hostage by the Corpse Brigade, the Baelvs don't even try to rescue her and instead directly get her killed so they can take down the Corpse Brigade. This makes Delita realize just how little the commoners are worth to the nobility. And so Delita began a long and bloody campaign to take the throne, during which time he becomes a double agent and proceeds to betray and backstab everyone around him. Now here's the thing, throughout Tactics it becomes pretty clear that the Church and the Crown are both pretty corrupt. So Delita's attempt to take the throne and reform the system from within is a pretty admirable goal, and it's a goal that the protagonist, the aforementioned Ramza, doesn't exactly argue with. However, here's the difference between the two. Ramza rejects the political machinations and corruption around him and tries to do good wherever he can and unmask the conspiracy. Delita, meanwhile, decides that instead he's going to beat them at their own game, in essence becoming the very thing that he's trying to destroy. And while I did say earlier that their goals pretty much aligned, Delita doesn't really see Ramza as an ally, he sees him as a pawn. A pawn that he respects, but a pawn nonetheless. And manipulation is something that Delita is very, very good at. I mean, let's take a look at his track record. He takes part in the Church's false flag operation to kidnap the heir apparent to the throne. He exposes a traitor in the Order of the Southern Sky in order to gain their leader, Duke Goltana's trust. He murders Goltana and frames Cid Orlando, fakes Orlando's death to let him go free because he's more useful alive, and then he marries the Queen. The man is a genius, and he knows exactly how to use everyone around him. But here's the funny thing about him. The way his story ends is almost a perfect parallel to the way Ramza's story ends. By the end of the game, Ramza stuck to his principles and unmasked the conspiracy in the Church and the Knights Templar, but he has to flee the country because he was declared a heretic, but at the same time he's surrounded by all of his friends and lived to go on more adventures afterwards. Compare this to Delita. Shortly after he's crowned king, Delita is attacked by the queen, who thinks that she was just another stepping stone on his path to gaining power, and that he's just going to kill her like he's killed everyone else. But the thing is, though, the queen is actually the one person Delita truly loved, but he's forced to kill her in self-defense, meaning that he may have gotten everything he ever wanted, but now he's completely alone. Delita is a perfect foil for Ramza, and one of the many reasons why Final Fantasy Tactics is such a great game. He may not fit the typical mold of a Final Fantasy villain, in fact being basically the deuteragonist, but his ruthlessness, cunning, manipulative nature, and tragic story make for one heck of an interesting figure.
Those decrepit basking fools in Arcades tie my hands, and look what happens. I tell you, this country's obstinacy knows no bounds.
I'm always sort of disappointed whenever people discuss the best villains in the Final Fantasy franchise, and this guy isn't among them. A lot of people tend to write off Final Fantasy XII because of how non-fantastic the plot is and how it mostly deals with war and politics, but that's precisely one of the reasons why I love it so much. After the more elaborate existential plots of 7, 8, 9, and 10, I honestly found this kind of a refreshing change of pace, and this is perfectly reflected in its villain, Vayne Solidor. Vayne is the third son of Emperor Gramus of Arcadia. However, his two older brothers were found to be traitors and killed, although Vayne may or may not have been behind that. As such, only he and his youngest brother Larsa are left, and Vayne is set to inherit the throne. Remember a few videos back when I talked about Dr. Cid and the Occuria and the plan to put the reins of history back in the hands of men? Vayne is one of the architects of that plan. He orchestrated an invasion into the country of Dalmasca in order to gain their vast amounts of nethicite to use against the Occuria, in the process getting himself appointed consul. Here's the thing about Vayne, though. He does care about the plan to defeat the Occuria and bring the reins of history back into the hands of men, but he also knows that world domination is a pretty sweet bonus. You see, House Solidor has been losing power within the Imperial Senate for quite a while. The Senate wants to appoint Larsa, Vayne's younger brother, as the puppet emperor, but Vayne isn't going to have that. It would completely undermine his house's power and authority. So what does he do? He murders the Emperor, his own father may I remind you, and frames the Senate so that he can have the Senate dissolved and give himself emergency powers with which to rule. However, there are a few funny things about this turn of events. First off, the fact that the Emperor may or may not have been in on it. I mean, this here is the last scene the two of them share together.
So, you would dirty your hands to keep his clean?
My hands are stained with blood. I see little reason to stay them now.
So they are. And so House Solidor lives on.
It's also established by this point that the Emperor is already dying of mysterious cough-itis, so maybe he figured that he'd use his death to the house's advantage. It's entirely possible. Then there's Larsa. Now, it's true that Vayne doesn't want to see Larsa become a puppet of the Senate, but there are a few points in the game where it feels like maybe he does want Larsa to become the Emperor in some capacity. But here's the thing about Larsa. He's this pure, sincere cinnamon roll of a person, and no one wants to see him get blood on his hands from taking over the world. So Vayne figures he'll take over the world and do all the dirty work and let Larsa become the Emperor afterwards. With this interpretation in mind, their interactions can be read in a whole different light, particularly this interaction late in the game.
You are mistaken. You are wrong, brother.
And if I am? You had best find the strength you need to correct me then.
There's a lot you can read into that. Now, I sort of mentioned this before, but part of Vayne's appeal to me has always been the fact that compared to all the other Final Fantasy villains, Vayne is just a guy. I mean, sure, he commands military authority and he's a charismatic politician, but he's just human. There's nothing special about him. Heck, as far as I'm aware, he's the only villain in the series to use martial arts when you fight him instead of using a giant freaking sword or magic powers. Add to that his relationship to his brother and the camaraderie he has with the other villains, and you have the most human main villain in the entire series. He's like the one villain in the entire series I could see myself going out to eat lunch with. We get more of this when he becomes the consul to Dalmasca. Now, bear in mind, Dalmasca is the territory that he invaded and he conquered, so the populace doesn't exactly greet him very warmly.
Is it with hatred you look upon your consul?
With hatred you look upon the Empire.
Spit on your empire! Go back to Arcadia!
There was little point in asking.
But Vayne is able to get them to start cheering for him with a grand total of 1 speech, and we find out throughout the game that he actually took his duties as consul seriously and was a pretty well-respected ruler. He's just so likable and his motivations are so interesting that you almost want to root for him until you remember, oh yeah, he's a puppy-kicking sociopath who wants to take over the world. Which brings us to the final battles against him. His first phase he uses martial arts, which like I said before, makes him really unique compared to the other villains. In his second form, he gets all hopped up on magicite and, well, he looks... well...
Kill me with fire!
And then in his final phase, he becomes the Undying, fusing together with Vana and using the remains of his battleship as armor. His design is incredibly busy and convoluted and there's way too much going on, but the fight itself is actually really good. Even if it is kind of annoying when he randomly stops taking damage halfway through. At the very end, even when he's defeated, he achieved everything that he wanted. Mankind is cut off from the Occuria, and his younger brother gets to be put in charge of a massive empire, thus ensuring that House Solidor would live on, so it's not like his plans failed. In the end, Vayne is sympathetic, charismatic, really intelligent, and overall just the most underrated villain in the entire series. Although he could probably do with a haircut. So, you know that old adage that a good villain doesn't know they're the villain? Well, evidently, nobody told Kuja that, because not only is he fully aware he's the villain, but he is a really good one. And not only that, but he is having the time of his life in that role. Kuja is a genome, basically an artificial human, and he was created by Garland. No, not that Garland. No, that's Garland spelled with an O. I'm talking about a different Garland. Why are there so many Garlands in this series? There we go, that's the one. Now, Garland here is an inhabitant of the dying world of Terra, and he created Kuja as a means of accomplishing his plan to assimilate the world of Gaia and keep his own world alive. Now, the specifics of that plan are a little too complicated for me to get into here, but to make a long story short, it involves sending an angel of death, Kuja in this case, to Gaia in order to cause a bunch of chaos and destruction and disrupt the life cycle. Here's the thing, though. Kuja was never meant to be permanent. Garland considered Kuja to be a flawed prototype at best, so he designed him to expire once his newer, better counterpart, Zidane, was finished. Once Kuja realized that he was literally on borrowed time, he set out to try and attain a power strong enough to defeat Garland and keep his soul, all the while still fulfilling his duties as an angel of death with relish. I've said it once before, and I'll say it again. My favorite Final Fantasy villains are the ones who have a flair for the theatric, and Kuja is no exception. Like I mentioned before, he is fully aware that he's the villain, and he is loving every second of it, gleefully indulging in every villainous cliche in the book, all from the comfort of his swanky, evil hideout. He carries himself like he's the villain of a Shakespearean epic. Upon seeing him for the first time, your first thought is probably something to the effect of, wait, that's a guy? Now, sort of like Seymour, a lot of Kuja's intimidation is sort of undercut by his design. I mean, just look at him! The man's wearing a thong! And pointy goblin shoes! But the thing that sets him apart from Seymour is the fact that his design perfectly fits his character. Kuja is incredibly flamboyant and individualistic, so it makes sense that he'd purposely want to stand out as much as possible. Something else Kuja's got going for him is his intelligence. Now, he's not really a typical mastermind per se, in that he's not really one to play the long game, but instead, he's really good at adapting to whatever circumstances he has to go through. Every time something doesn't go his way, he finds a way to adapt. A bunch of his mass-produced black mages become self-aware and go against their programming. He tricks them into thinking he can fix their limited lifespans and gets them to follow him willingly. Garland finds out about his intentions and destroys the creature he was planning to use against him. No biggie, he can find another one. The heroes rescue his hostages and escape. He'll just capture one of the rescuers while they're on their way out. He is always and consistently one step ahead of the game. That is, until the game's grand finale. Towards the end of the game, he finds out that no matter what he does in spite of defeating Garland, he's going to die prematurely regardless. Now, one thing I neglected to mention about Kuja is he is a massive narcissist. He has an incredibly high opinion of himself and sees everyone else as less valuable than him. And once he finds out that he's going to die, he can't swallow the idea that the world is going to go on without him, so he goes full nihilist, deciding that if he can't enjoy life, then no one else should be able to either. So Kuja achieves a new form that allows him to destroy entire worlds, and an awesome fight ensues. Actually, on my most recent playthrough, I was amused to realize that the fight against Kuja basically boiled down to him letting the party beat the crap out of him until he got his limit break. That is actually kind of hilarious. He uses his new trance state to fight the party, but unfortunately, it's followed by a battle against the embodiment of death itself, which, while thematically satisfying for Final Fantasy IX, comes right the heck out of nowhere with zero build-up and steals Kuja's thunder. This isn't really all bad, however. After all, this results in Kuja being the only main villain in the entire series to actually redeem himself, sacrificing himself to save the party after their literal brush with death. So while he may not be much to look at first, Kuja really makes a good impression as a villain with a combination of his sympathetic origins and devious personality, easily earning himself a spot in the upper echelon of Final Fantasy baddies. Believe it or not, Kefka isn't number 1. Please don't kill me. But even still, in a series as vast and varied as Final Fantasy, number 2 is still nothing to sneeze at. And even if I don't think he's the number 1 best, Kefka really does deserve all the accolades hurled his way. Kefka was once a general working for Emperor Gestahl. He was the prototype for the Magitech Knights, who underwent a process that gifted them with the power to use magic. However, Kefka was the first, so the process hadn't been perfected yet, and his mind was twisted into that of an insane nihilist. To Kefka, life is meaningless, and destruction that is the only thing that gives his life validation. So he gleefully went about doing Gestahl's dirty work as they planned to unearth the Warring Triad, 3 statues said to keep the world in balance and contain unlimited power. However, when they find it, Kefka just goes, "You know what? I want it," and betrays Gestahl. He moves the statues out of alignment and he becomes a god, laying waste to the world and twisting it to his own whims, all because he thinks it's fun. Kefka usually gets compared to the Joker, for pretty good reason. It goes beyond just his clown-like exterior. The man is pointlessly cruel and loves every second of it. Just to give you a few examples, before the story even starts, he has the protagonist, or the closest thing to one at any rate, Terra, under mind control. And the first thing he has her do is use her magic to incinerate 40 of his own soldiers just as a test drive. When the Emperor is very effectively besieging Doma and all they have to do to win is wait it out, Kefka just up and poisons the water supply to just kill everyone in it because he thinks it's taking too long. It doesn't stop when he achieves godhood either. One of the first things he does is wipe the town of Mobliz off the face of the earth, but he leaves all the children alive to fend for themselves because he thought it'd be funny. His dialogue is a treat as well, although admittedly that's mostly thanks to the brilliant English localization by Ted Woolsey. Every word he says is dripping with malice and contempt for everyone and everything around him, and yet he's legitimately hilarious. Kefka is one of the most quotable villains in all of gaming, right up there with the likes of GLaDOS from Portal. Almost all of his scenes are just plain funny, such as his introduction where, while marching across the desert, he stops to force 2 of his underlings to wipe the sand off of his boots. Easily his most memorable trait is his love of destruction. It gets surprisingly tragic, though, if you really think about it. The ending implies that Kefka is incapable of feeling or even comprehending things like love or happiness or the simple pleasures of living. As far as he's concerned, if it doesn't last forever, it's meaningless. This actually makes him a pretty effective foil for Terra, who, like Kefka, is emotionally stunted at the start of the game and can't seem to figure out what this love thing is. But while Terra finds something that gives her life meaning, Kefka is left a grinning, empty shell of a man. And yes, as many people are so keen to point out, Kefka does destroy the world successfully, something that most villains in the series only dream of. And while I would argue that Exdeath got just as far along in his ambitions, Kefka did it better, and Kefka did it bigger. I'd also like to point out that as far as I know, he wasn't really even planning to become a god from the very beginning. The opportunity just presented itself and he figured, why not? Though this does lead to the one problem with Kefka. It is really impressive that he causes the apocalypse halfway through the game, but once that happens, he just sort of drops out of the story. Throughout the entire second half, he's just sitting on his tower firing lasers at random towns, not really doing much. He doesn't make another appearance until the final battle. But said final battle is an absolute doozy. After he reduces the world to a barren wasteland, the heroes regroup and confront him at his throne atop a tower made of the ruins of everything he destroyed. After ascending a series of monsters themed after the Divine Comedy in a pretty clever reference, they eventually face Kefka himself in an impressive godlike form, all set to Dancing Mad, one of the best songs in all of gaming. Even if the fight itself is a tad on the easy side, it's still one heck of a finale. Heck, because he absorbed the power of the Triad, killing him also removes magic from the world entirely. So even in death, Kefka managed to screw everyone over one last time. Kefka really is held in high regard as one of the best villains not just in the series, but in all of gaming. His simple yet deep motivations, his bottomless cruelty, quotable lines, disarming design, and frightening power all propel him to the best part of the best game in the series. However, I would argue that, within the context of the series at least, there is one villain I think trumps him, if only slightly. So tune in tomorrow, and if Kefka is the Joker, get ready to meet the Riddler. Well, everyone, happy Halloween, and welcome to number 1. Before we talk about who I think the best Final Fantasy villain is, however, I think it's time we acknowledge a few of the villains who almost but didn't quite make it on the list for one reason or another. Everyone, give a round of applause for our honorable mentions.
Fashionably late, I see.
Ardyn.
Insomnia, the crown city of my kingdom. I bid you a warm welcome.
I understand completely that a lot of you are going to disagree with me on this, but I stand by it. Not only did Ardyn leave a bigger impact on me personally than any other villain, but he's the best in my eyes because while Kefka was the best villain with certain aspects, Ardyn checks the most boxes of any of the villains on this countdown. Long before the events of Final Fantasy XV, a plague known as the Star Scourge spread across Eos, turning many people into demons. Ardyn Lucis Caelum was a member of the royal family who possessed powerful healing abilities, and he went about relieving the suffering of many by containing the plague inside himself, along with a lot of demons. However, when the time came for him to ascend to the throne and gain the blessing of the Astrals, he was deemed impure and corrupt due to containing the Star Scourge within himself, and his brother betrayed him and ascended instead. Due to the demons within him, Ardyn became immortal and was already furious by his perceived betrayal, but could only watch as his name was demonized and wiped from the annals of history. Now going by the surname Izunia and working alongside the Niflheim Empire, he plans to enact his revenge on the royal family and the world by not only unleashing the Star Scourge, but also by destroying the current king, Noctis, and making his life a living hell. Let's start with his appearance. I love Ardyn's design. Apparently his look was inspired by Al Capone, and it shows. He looks equal parts like a snazzy gangster and a hobo, making for a really cool aesthetic, and his scarf managed to homage Sephiroth without being too on the nose about it. That and I'm just a sucker for fedoras. His theme music is appropriately sinister and his voice acting is excellent. His personality is a lot more subdued than, say, Kefka or Kuja, but it's no less entertaining or intimidating.
For a moment I felt death's chill wind. Such is the might of the gods. But then I remembered I'm immortal.
Every word that he says gives off that really cool, if I wanted to kill you, you'd already be dead vibe, even before it's revealed just how evil he is. And he's also a huge troll, being cryptic and vague on purpose just to confuse and frighten people. He knows completely how much he creeps people out, and he clearly loves doing it. He doesn't really dive into the ham as often as some other villains, but he steals every scene he's in. Like I mentioned last time, Kefka is comparable to the Joker, but Ardyn is closer in style to the Riddler, relying more on trickery and manipulation. Don't get me wrong though, he's just as cruel as Kefka, but just in a different way. To borrow another comic book analogy, Kefka is sort of like Carnage, while Ardyn is like Venom. Both of them are just as powerful and just as evil, but whereas one of them kills and destroys indiscriminately, the other aims it all squarely at a single person. It's astounding how effective a villain can be if they focus all of their efforts to screw over a single person. He kills pretty much all of Noctis' loved ones just to give him motivation to seek the powers of the royal arms, and then actively helps him just so he can kill him when he properly ascends and finally put an end to the Lucian royal family. Later on he uses the magic of illusion to switch places with one of Noctis' best friends, Prompto, tricking Noctis into nearly killing him. A lot of other villains have employed the magic of illusion, but they've never really been used to this extent. Once Noctis does begin unlocking his latent powers, Ardyn no longer has a reason to hold back. He blankets the world in eternal night and swarms the world with demons, even transforming all the residents of the Imperial capital into demons just for the heck of it, taking the time to mock Noctis over the PA system as he makes his way through.
Betraying your friends for the greater good, the mark of a monarch. Step forth, your majesty.
Once Noctis finally does arrive to confront him, Ardyn does nothing but screw with him. He surrounds his lair with a force field identical to the one around Noctis' home city that Ardyn destroyed just to rub it in how Noctis couldn't stop him from killing his father. And just as one final kick in the teeth, he dangles the corpses of all of Noctis' deceased loved ones from the ceiling of the throne room. That is a level of sadism rarely ever seen from this series. Kefka may have gotten more done, but Ardyn's brand of chaos is a lot more personal and emotionally charged, and therefore more effective. But the main reason I see Ardyn as number 1 is because he exemplifies the best aspects of all of the best villains in the series. Like Kuja or Caius, he has a backstory that makes him sympathetic despite the scale of his atrocities. But like Ultimecia, the specifics of said backstory are left up to interpretation. It's a pretty good balance that adds an element of mystery while still giving you a sense of what makes him tick. He has the charisma of Vayne, the constant hanging presence of Sephiroth, the dark comedy of Kefka, and the pettiness and horrific nature of Exdeath. Also of note is that while Sephiroth may have had delusions of being a messiah figure, Ardyn actually was that messiah figure and he got screwed out of it. Capping all of this off is a final one-on-one fight that, while it isn't really the best fight in the series and may have some mechanical issues, but it's one of the most unique final battles in the series. He doesn't get a fancy transformation, just a really cool one-on-one duel where he has demonic counterfeits of all of Noctis' abilities. And a lot like some of the other villains on this list, even in death, he basically gets everything he wanted. Only time will tell if he has the same impact on the series that Kefka or Sephiroth had. I mean, 15 is only a few years old. But even now, Ardyn is one of the most well-remembered aspects of this game. He'll be the gold standard for Final Fantasy villains going forward. He exemplifies everything I love about villains. And again, you might disagree with me, but I stand by my decision to rank Ardyn Izunia as the best villain in all of Final Fantasy.